Hello there and welcome to another Bobeats synthesizer review, and today we are checking out the new A1 synthesizer from GRP Synthesizers. You might not have heard about this brand before. It's a small boutique brand from Italy that makes some quite interesting synths, and they sent me their A1 to test out. It's a one-voice analog synthesizer with a sub-oscillator, 18 dB filter with drive, full ADSR, 2 LFOs, and while it's definitely a simple synth, it's also a simple synth that simply sounds good. GRP synths are hand-assembled in Italy, and I would call GRP a slightly more premium brand, which also means that the A1 will not be the most budget-friendly mono synth you can find. But there is a definite quality to the A1, both in terms of sound but also in build quality, which surpasses many of the cheaper options in terms of small desktop mono synths. I also want to say that you can call the A1 a semi-modular synth because it has patch points, but I wouldn't. I would call it a mono desktop synth with additional CV connectivity, because there is not a lot going on here in terms of patch points, but more about that later. So let's talk about build quality. The unit feels very solid. It feels a little bit heavier than you might expect from such a small synthesizer. Now the edges here, these are metal plates here. Well, the entire unit is metal, I guess. Well, the metal sides here are a bit sharper than I would have liked. The knobs here feel really nice, and even the small Volca style knobs here have a lot of resistance actually. But since it's a small unit, and if you have large hands, some of the knobs here, especially these small ones for the LFO shape, can be a little hard to turn. On the back of the unit, we have a MIDI input. You can connect, for example, a MIDI keyboard and play it. And there's also USB, which you can use for power, and you can use a power bank to power it, no problem. I use an Anker power bank. I'm not sponsored by them in any way, but I do recommend Anker power banks for powering your music gear. Now, I am not entirely sure why you would want to power this using a power bank, but it's nice that it works. You can also take the synth out of its casing and put it in a Eurorack case if you want to. let's start off with a little overview of the A1. So we have a MIDI interface here, and here we have glide. We also have a control for bend amount if I turn it up. So you can set how much you want the pitch bend from the MIDI keyboard to affect the pitch of the oscillator. And over here we have an important switch. So this is key velocity from the MIDI keyboard to the filter envelope generator. So basically if we set the VCA here to filter EG and we turn this up, turn the filter down a bit. This lets us control the filter frequency here using the velocity. So if you play with a lighter touch, the filter is more closed, and if we hit the key harder, the filter opens up. So it just adds a level of articulation, which is kind of nice. And since we're talking about the filter and filter articulation, we also have tracking. So tracking basically means that if you play lower notes, the filter is more closed, and if you play higher notes, the filter is more open. So if I play a high note here, so without any filter tracking on and the cutoff turned down, the filter is closed. So if I play some high notes, down, you can hear on the lower notes that the filter is more closed. So this also adds just a layer of articulation. But now let's move over to something a little bit more interesting, the oscillator section. We have sawtooth, triangle, and square. Very nice. I think these are very rich waveforms. There's a lot here to work with. And we have pitch. And you can select octave. And for the square wave, we have pulse width modulation. With either a manual setting or you can set it to LFO1. And you can modulate the frequency of the oscillator here using the LFO 1 or 2 or the envelope generator. So using the envelope to modulate the pitch, you can create some interesting drum sounds, for example. So let's use LFO number 1 here, and the LFOs are interesting because they have different speed settings, so slow, mid, and fast. So fast gets you into audio rate modulation very quickly. And beyond using FM to create those kind of bell-like sounds and metallic sounds, you can create some gnarly basses. So here I have the saw, a lot of frequency modulation using LFO number 1 here. You can hear we get these kind of rough overtones, and if we add in the sub and some drive and some EG to filter, some resonance, and so it's about finding the balance between the LFO speed and how much frequency modulation you want. Often what I'm trying to do is I turn up the sub and then I use the FM knob here to sort of set the tuning of the frequency modulation. And sometimes you get some really good sounding results and sometimes it just sounds weird and metallic. And just to build on this here patch, on the filter here we also have frequency modulation. So you can use alpha 1 here, which is set to fast, and just get some wild sounds, but just a bit like this. I mean, I don't know, like, do you like it? I kind of like it. It's Let's add in some noise, because we do have noise. I think it's white noise. I'll put a little text here if it's not. Ooh, kind of nice. So I added some glide, some filter tracking, and I just tweaked the envelope generator and the frequency here and the resonance a bit, and yeah, nice. So yeah, I do think that it's a simple synth, but it simply sounds good. So moving on, we have the little mixer here with the VCO, sub, and noise. And then we have the VCA module with either a gate plus release setting or a filter EG setting and a hold setting. And then we have the filter, which is an 18 dB filter, and you can get some really nice acidic squelchy tones out of it. And then we have drive. It's a very nice, like, musical, smooth feeling drive. It doesn't like super distort the sound or anything. Especially if we go for the triangle. We add some sub, some noise. And I think that this goes to show that a quality product that is well designed, even though it's simple, can sound really interesting. And yeah, when I'm sitting down and playing around with this, I often end up in some interesting musical place, even though it's a fairly straightforward and basic synthesizer. So what else is there? Well, we can use LFO 1 or 2 here to modulate the filter, get some filter sweeps going, or just audio rate modulate it like I showed you previously. And we have the envelope generator, attack, decay, sustain, release. Nothing that you haven't seen before, but something that you might not have seen before is a fast, mid, and slow setting. So basically this just changes how long or quick the envelope is, which is really nice. At a fast setting, you get really snappy results. And more drawn out if you go mid or even slow. So that's kind of nice, kind of interesting. It's really good if you're moving between, say, making lead sounds where you might want to use the mid or slow setting, and more percussive or bassy sounds using the fast setting, for example. And then we have the two LFOs over here, and it's really nice to have two of them. Not all small synths have more than one. So yeah, two is better than one in this case, more is better. And they are not exactly the same, so both of them have different speed settings. You can have a really slow LFO or something that goes into audio rate modulation, but there is a difference. So the first one has random as a waveform. But they both have something which is quite interesting, and that is the ability to shape the waveform of the LFO. Now this is something that you don't see on most synths. The ability not only to change the waveform of the LFO, but also shape it. So getting something in between, say, a triangle and a ramp LFO, for example. And you use these small knobs here. They offer a lot of resistance. They can be a little hard to turn, but then again, you won't be turning them accidentally. So I guess that's a good thing as well. ability to shape the waveform of the LFO is nice. It's not a night and day difference from just having the static waveforms being selectable, but it's nice. It's an interesting feature, something that I'd like to see in more synths. And then we come to the question of the patch points and whether or not this is a semi-modular synth or just a synthesizer with patch points. And I think it's more the latter, because as you can see here, we have volt per octave, we have gate in, we have CV in for the PWM, you have CV in for the filter, CV in for the VCA, external input, you also have VCO out, VCF out, EG out, so envelope out, the LFO 1 and 2 out, and phones and main out. And to be honest, there's not a lot here that you can use for self-patching that isn't already routed, available here using a knob or a setting here on the synth itself. So I'd say that it's more a synth with patch points than a semi-modular that you can do a ton of cool self-patching on it. If you compare it to, for example, I don't know, a Mother 32, a DFAM, a Subharmonicon, or perhaps the Taiga, those are all more interesting options if you want to self-patch, if you want to patch things together in new and interesting ways to create new and interesting sounds. And here I feel that the patch points is a little bit more for interconnecting this with other modules or other gear that has patch points, not so much for self-patching. So now we've come to the verdict. Do I recommend the A1? Well, the A1 from GRP Synthesizers is neither the most feature-packed or the most budget-friendly of small mono synths, but it sounds very good. You might have heard the term sweet spots being used when talking about synths, and it refers to the idea that synths, especially analog ones, have certain settings where the synth really shines, where it sounds amazing. And the A1 has many such sweet spots. And one reason for this is that the drive is not overbearing, it's quite musical, it doesn't overly distort the sound, and the frequency modulation that you can apply to the oscillator and filter is actually quite usable, which isn't always the case for some synths. Sometimes it just doesn't sound as good. While the A1 is definitely a simple synth at its core, it's a simple synth that simply does what it's supposed to do, and it does it really well. And frankly, I'd personally pick the A1 over many other mono synths that I own, and that is because the sound is good, it has exactly the functions that I want and that I use and that I need from a mono synth. And frankly, the size is very appealing to me, and I like that it's a no-frills kind of experience. And I just love the fact that I don't have to remember, for example, even one shift command. But there are, of course, a few negatives as well. First and foremost is that it's a bit more expensive than the competition. And secondly, that it's a very basic monosynth without any extras. And also, the patch bay is quite limited, especially for self-patching. For example, I would have loved to be able to CV control the shape of the LFOs. That would have been really nice. Frankly, the most important thing is that there's so much competition right now in the analog mono synth space. The Create Audio, East Beast comes to mind, for example, Korg Monologue that I just reviewed, like a Multimedia Uno Synth Pro desktop, and the Dreadbox synthesizers, just to mention a few. But all of that being said, I do think that the A1 is worth taking a look at, because let's be real, most of us only use a fraction of the functions available on most synths anyway. So perhaps something simple that simply sounds good is simply the way to go.